Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, November 7th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now a growing body of more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. This was at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th. Before we get into it, though, I want to introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy. And Andy is also our broadcaster of our famous 9/11 Freefall show. Andy, are you back? Oh, device is not connected, it says. Well, what Andy's going to give you instructions about is to let you know that we're happy to take questions, your questions, and just submit them in the questions and information online form at ae911truth.org. You can find that at ae911truth.org/continuing-ed. I think that's the right one, but you'll find it there. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use parking project with near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail and mid-rise office space. Altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. Hi, Andy, are you back? It says devices not connected. So you might try again. Let me see if this one's, unmute your mic. Andy, are you there? Not yet. So Andy will work out that, and we'll come back to Andy in a minute. But let's get right into the issue today, which is the controlled demolition of the third skyscraper on 9/11, World Trade Center Building 7. You know, most architects and engineers know nothing about the third worst structural failure in modern history. This is absolutely incredible. This is Building 7. I'm an architect with the American Institute of Architects, as I mentioned, and we have 90,000 members now. And we have not received one bulletin on this incredibly catastrophic collapse. No plane hit this building. Now, planes hit the Twin Towers, and we'll talk about them next week in part 2 and part 3 in this 3-part series. But this is a 47-story skyscraper, easily the tallest building in most of our states, seen here, dwarfed, of course, next to the tallest buildings in the world at the time they were built, the Twin Towers. So let's get into it. It's part of the World Trade Center complex, as you see here, just north of the World Trade Center 5 and 6. And it was about 110 yards north of the North Tower. And you see it here, having survived just fine the collapse of the towers. It did get a little bit of damage. NIST says that damage was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. We'll get into what those significant factors were. But here it is now about to collapse. Here, we'll just take a quick look at it, and then we'll dissect it. The east penthouse collapses first, and then 7 seconds later, the entire building comes down smoothly, rapidly, suddenly into its own footprint. Now, we've seen that before, and we'll get into that. But here's what the official story, after 7 years of punting this football back and forth and around and coming up with various theories, this is the official theory at this point.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Primarily due to fires. Let's see. Let's share our screen first of all, so you can see it. These fires, the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of for Building 7. And let's add Andy back into the stream. Hi, Andy, can you hear us? I want to make sure he's with us so we can.
Can everybody hear me?
There we go. I've got you unmuted.
I had to jump to the laptop again, Richard.
Oh, okay. No problem. We got you covered.
Right.
So if you want to go on mute, we'll continue and come back when we need you, please. And it may happen today. So you can see these fires are not catastrophic at all, as actually claimed by NIST, them being then the cause of this collapse of this building. They're few, they're relatively small, and they're scattered. And this is the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. Now, these fires are burning on the east side early in the afternoon, and that is the area where NIST focuses their attention. Now, they move over toward the north side by about 3 p.m. They're halfway across, and then as you'll see, they continue moving toward the west, to the right here. So let's see, there we go. NIST focuses their attention on the northeast corner underneath the east penthouse because it did fail first. And they want us to tie the failure of that penthouse into the collapse of this building. And we'll see if that becomes true or not later when we get into the major university study that ended up pulling the rug out from underneath the NIST report, which we'll talk about. So column 79 is the area of concern. There was some damage on the south side. They say this is not a significant factor in the building's collapse. But let's look at their fire simulation, which shows the fires burning on the south side, which was the side facing the north tower. Some debris hit it. It's okay. So there's some fires burning, and at 3 o'clock, those fires are moving over toward the east and then across the north. And they say that these fires are burning in and around column 79 from 3 p.m. till well past 5 p.m. So that is an essential component of their failure theory, which we will get into here in a moment, which contradicts their assertion also in chapter 5 that of their report, the 1,000-page report that they put out in 2008, 7 years after 9/11. This report finally came out after everybody who knew anything about Building 7, which weren't that many, the collapse of it, they'd forgotten by this time. So what do they say? Such fires didn't persist at any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. Well, that flies in the face of their theory, which says those fires were burning on this floor. But the photographs also fly in the face because there's no fire in and around the northeast area of column 79 after 3 o'clock. Those fires have burned. You can see them over here, actually, well past by 3:50. They're moving over to the north side, and they're completely burned out on that floor by the time the building collapsed at 5:20. A more accurate representation of those fires was done here, and sure enough, those fires are burning on the south side at 2 p.m. They move around the east side at about 3 p.m. And consistent with the photographs, those fires are moved on well past. And we're talking about not these fires here, those are down on the 7th floor. They're going to be moving on past too. But these fires up here there's no fires burned out. There's no fires in this area at all on the 12th floor up here, which is their area of focus. In fact, they've moved on, consistent with the photographs. They're burned out in this area altogether. So that's completely contradictory, the photographic information evidence, to their fire analysis, because they need their fire simulation here to justify their theory that fire brought down this building. Let's go a little deeper into this theory.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Okay, let's go into it even a little deeper.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Okay, let's back it up just a hair. The theory says that the fires that they say were raging in the building on this 12th floor at this time, at the time of the collapse, actually, at 5:20, they say that they caused expansion of these long span steel beams, which could not have happened because they're fireproofed. As you can see halfway through construction of the fireproofing here. And so they couldn't have expanded. That doesn't happen. And we'll see that in tests that have been done on steel frame buildings in a moment. But they say that they expanded and pushed this girder off of its seat on this column 79. Well, that girder couldn't have been pushed off of its seat because it had 30 shear studs tying it to the concrete slab up above. But NIST simply claims that those shear studs were not there. But these are from the shop drawings that actually show that they were, in fact, installed. But let's say they weren't installed. And this girder falls off of its seat. Well, it couldn't have done that because that seat is 12 inches wide. It would have had to have been pushed all 12 inches off of its seat. But NIST says, no, it only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat because the flange folded, the bottom piece folded, once the web, the middle eye part of the column, passed the edge of the seat. So it only had to be pushed 6 inches off of its seat. But then they provide only calculations that show that it could only be pushed 5 inches off of its seat under the worst temperature conditions. But even if that's true, it couldn't have fallen off because there were on the shop drawings, again, flange stiffeners, 3/4 inch stiffeners, which you see here in plan and here in elevation, welded to the web and the flange, reinforcing that flange such that would have made it impossible to fold as NIST claimed. NIST says, oh, those stiffeners, we didn't put them in our calculation because they were only added to prevent web crippling of this center part of the girder. Well, whether or not web crippling was an issue, those stiffeners were included in the construction and would have provided complete coverage for that girder, forcing NIST to have, this would then force NIST to claim that the girder was pushed all the way off of its seat, which they can't justify. So they're between quite a rock and a hard place here. So then when this girder falls off of its seat, floor 13 falls on 12, 12 falls on 10, and so on for 9 floors, leaving the column unbraced, and then it buckles in the theory of NIST. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. And as you can see, they failed miserably, even just so far. But we continue because floor 13 couldn't have fallen on 12 because there's 2 other major girders tying that floor to that column 79 on the other side. So and even if they weren't there, this floor 13 would have required 632,000 pounds of dynamic force to break the column, the girder connections below it on floor 12. So, and so on. So that's 10 times less or more than what is required, because we only have 60,000 pounds of impact to require 10 times more than that. So this whole scenario could not have even have happened to start the progressive collapse that NIST claims happened here. Let's look at their animation.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
So there's breakage down below, and then that goes all the way up to the roof. And we have 400 structural steel connections failing every second. Completely unrealistic in any kind of actual scenario. Well, let's look at it side by side with the video and see if it matches quite well. Well, the east penthouse seems to match fairly well, but there's no catastrophic failure from the down the channel, as you see in their model. It doesn't occur in the video. So we also don't have the east to west failure, which is claimed by NIST here. They've only got it in their model on the east side. The west side is not even, it seems almost infinitely stiff. And still, it begins to fall over to the side. And then they stop it after just 2 seconds into the global collapse. So why won't they show us what happens after this? Well, it wouldn't look anything like the actual collapse at that point. Not that it does anyway. So we submitted a request for correction, which you can do with federal agencies under the Data Quality Act, and they have to respond. And they wrote back and said, no, we can't release the computer input data. It might jeopardize public safety. Well, doesn't it jeopardize public safety to refuse to release this valuable data so architects and engineers can peer review the work that was exclusively given to NIST and then subbed out to specific contractors under their control? So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. We have a question. How did the towers come down? We do background research. How have other towers come down? We make observations. We construct a hypothesis. This is our best guess as to how the towers came down. Maybe fire did bring it down. There were fires in the building. Maybe it was explosions or controlled demolition, which we'll show plenty of evidence for today. We test those hypotheses with experiments. And by the way, those hypotheses are all laid out if they make any sense at all, if they have a chance of being supported by the evidence. We don't focus in exclusively on our favorite hypothesis, such as fire, because of our financial or political obligations, for instance, which there are plenty of problems with regarding a lack of objectivity and so forth. So we draw conclusions based on those results. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data, for instance. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct another hypothesis until it is corroborated and until we have a complete supporting or substantial supporting by the evidence. So we're going to do some background research today. Let's look at some of the forces that have destroyed buildings. Let's start with fire. It's certainly destroyed a number of buildings. It's an organic, a chaotic process. It burns out an area in 20 minutes or so in a modern office building. That's all the fuel there is to keep a fire going. And NIST even acknowledges that fires only persist in one area for 20 or 30 minutes. Well, we haven't had a steel frame skyscraper collapse due to fire. But say in wood frame buildings, what would we expect? The building would fall in stages. It's a chaotic process following laws of entropy, increasing chaos, disintegration. The building would fall over, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure that might be underneath it. But there were tests done, so we don't have to guess about what would happen in steel frame buildings. They built an 8-story one in 1995 in the UK, and with exclusive purpose of setting it on fire. And they fireproofed some of the beams and columns, but not all of them, as you see. So this is in a worst case condition. They put huge fuel loads.
The largest test of its kind
Let's
ever
take a look.
conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, we're referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse in the case of Building 7, exclusively due to fire. We'll look at the Twin Towers in some detail next week and in the week after. Part 2 and 3 of this 3-part series. So the conclusion here is that these types of buildings are inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. The connections don't fail. Recall that 400 structural steel connections failing every second in the NIST computer animation model. No, if there's any sagging, if there's any failure, it's a sagging of the steel beams, and mostly those which are not fireproofed. Again, the worst case. We fireproof all of our modern office buildings, tall buildings like skyscrapers. But let's take a look at the history of fires in these buildings.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did these buildings, which were completely engulfed in fire, skyscrapers around the world after 9/11. No collapses here. What about natural collapses? These buildings certainly failed, in this case due to earthquakes, but we recognize the building at the bottom as a building having collapsed. It doesn't fall like a house of cards. The column and beam connections are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So that's important. Let's do some more research, find out what buildings, look like when they're exploded, like these. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds that are expanding at incredible speeds due to the hot gases from the chemical reactions from the explosions. They expand in cauliflower-shaped forms. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have this phenomena, you know you have explosions. Now, explosions are not a part of the official story, so we'll see if yet even so these phenomena occurs. How about controlled demolition itself? We have thousands of examples from around the world. It takes a sophisticated team of engineers and explosives loaders to do this. They place explosives at key locations in the building and set them off in a synchronized fashion, usually starting at the bottom of the building, but not always. And then they destroy it floor by floor, synchronized. So there's only a handful of companies that can do this. And fire has never done this to a building. So our comparison is not going to be too difficult, comparing typical features of controlled demolitions to fires. We'll start with this one. There's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure. Feature number two, a symmetrical collapse into the building's own footprint, if that's what they want to achieve. Number three, there's a patterned removal of column supports. That's how we get that symmetry. And this results in a free fall acceleration quite often through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure that's in the way of that has been holding the building up for years. And of course, that results in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, a very visible feature of controlled demolition. And one of the other goals, of course, limited damage to adjacent structures. There's patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. There's broken up concrete floors. They don't want to have to go back and manually jackhammer all those floors up when they could have been taken out by explosives or down to movable pieces at least. Feature number 8, there's explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. And they're isolated explosive ejections. There's chemical evidence of explosive devices left behind in their residue, of course. So if we have these features in a catastrophic failure, we know we have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. A fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. The fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. So if the government documentation, that can be very helpful also in this circumstantial corroborative evidence and eyewitness testimony that can be very helpful in determining what is a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge, of course, of the destruction. People know in advance that a controlled demolition is going to happen. Their experts agree, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a failure is a controlled demolition or not. With video documentation, of course, this can all be proof of controlled demolition. A set of proof which we're now going to apply to World Trade Center Building 7. Beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Let's go to Dan Rather, who describes this destruction for us, and take it from there.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, Dan never used these words subsequently after the day of 9/11. And we've never seen Building 7 come down or a video of its destruction on mainstream television, with like 2 exceptions early on after 9/11. So, I mean, again, this is the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history after the Twin Towers. So it should be one of the most talked about building failures. But something happened to the narrative here after 9/11. Well, feature number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Let's notice the main penthouse and screen wall. The west penthouse and screen wall, they come down a half a second prior to the overall building. What does that imply? That implies that the columns directly beneath them, the core columns of the building, have been removed somehow a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building. But wait a minute. NIST says the collapse started on the left, where the penthouse has already come down in this particular view, and then spread from east to west in about 10 seconds, which is ludicrous in and of itself. But you can see that that's not happening. No, the entire building drops uniformly a half a second after its core drops. Well, that's one of the goals in controlled demolition, is to take the core down first, create a hole, if you will, to pull the outside of the building in on itself so it doesn't peel out outwards. And indeed, it falls into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint, indicating a very symmetrical collapse here. But maybe we're not quite convinced yet. Let's look at Building 7 on the left, a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper before 9/11? Should it not have been the only rational hypothesis, or at least the first hypothesis seriously considered? But no, this question didn't get answered for 8 years after 9/11 in an FAQ published on NIST's website, and a set of very frequently asked questions. Did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse? NIST concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur. Well, we'll show you today that they did. And found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. Well, we'll show you the existence of several blast events. The smallest blast capable of falling the building's critical column would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. We'll show you a technology that doesn't create those high impact audio signatures today. But these are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of, and they are said to have brought this building down symmetrically. Think about it. What's going on here? How do you bring a building down symmetrically? Well, you have to take out all the core columns, and then a half a second later, all the perimeter columns. Any deviation in that pattern, the building will begin to tip over. This is intuitive. The 7th grader can figure this out. Does fire have the precision to bring down all 80 columns virtually at once? That's a key question for you. These fires. How fast is this building coming down? This is key data. Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to Freefall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
But as structural engineers tell us,
this building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Because even when columns fail, they still provide a minimal resistance. In this case, about 25% of their complete capacity, even after they buckle. NIST was forced into acknowledging the free fall of this building, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, faster and faster each second, for a third of this building's 7-second fall. But then they simply say this is consistent with our earlier results, which is completely inconsistent with their earlier results. They're hiding the implications of free fall, which means the structure disappeared. Speaking of which, what happened to the structure? Well, we had a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame building, which collapses like a house of cards. This is where the columns and beams are rigidly welded to one another and, designed to take exterior loads like earthquakes and particularly hurricanes on the East Coast. And so we might have, if there was any collapse at all, we might have had a very asymmetric pile, 20, 30 stories tall. But here, everything's compressed into less than 6 stories. Remember, buildings that fall naturally, we see a building at the bottom, not a house of cards. What about the adjacent structures? Is there limited damage? Yeah, the building fell into its own footprint almost. A little bit of damage to the Verizon building and the post office, but it's quite limited. We have sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. Well, first, let's go to the official story on this subject.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
No? Well, let's go to some of those witnesses. Here's Daryl, a medical student, being interviewed after the collapse of this building.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw.
And this gentleman, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman,
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who was on his way back into the building, not realizing that it had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. He and Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, had gotten back into the building to the 23rd floor where they were supposed to meet with people, apparently. And here they are trying to get out of the building, and look what's happening to them.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Bombs? Bombs like these heard in the late morning of 9/11. Obviously, the Twin Towers had come down already. So we're not talking about the same bombs, but bombs nevertheless. Let's listen.
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
We're told by official sources that these types of sounds are the sound of one floor hitting another. None of the explosions are a part of the official story. And we have evidence through this series of all kinds of explosions. In fact, it's picked up by another witness, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, 20 miles north of downtown of the World Trade Center. Well, the official narrative says that these seismic waves were produced by the collapse of World Trade Center 7, but is that possible? The peak seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds. But the start of the building collapse isn't for 10 seconds later. So how can it cause the seismic signal? Doesn't make any sense, right? Well, NIST has an answer to this. This is likely due to the falling of debris from inside the collapse of the building. In other words, they're saying that 10 seconds earlier than this overall collapse that you see here, there is debris from inside hitting the ground. But how can that be possible if the entire core structure is standing up until a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building? So the seismic signal would have already happened 10 seconds before that. So caught in a lie again. Well, there's an applied geophysics expert, Andre Rousseau, who in 2009 documented this. He's the author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. He has something to say about this. Well, first of all, the bell-like form of the graph points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. They undeniably have an explosive origin. So this is very helpful as well. Not helpful for NIST, but helpful to get at the truth of what really happened here. In fact, an effort is made by the National Fire Protection Association, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, to help us determine what could be responsible for the incredible heat produced here. They say, well, look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, these plumes are exactly what we see racing away in every direction after the collapse of Building 7. Expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes of hot gases coming from an incredible source of heat. Is it something like this? No. Those were surely extinguished, these fires, upon the collapse of the building. So what else is going on inside this building? Something on the order of this is what we're looking at. Well, let's go in and dig in and see if we can't come up with some answers to find the source of that heat. As we look at feature number 9, hotspots on the surface of Building 7. Oops. There we go. Here, 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit. That's as hot as most office fires ever get. And these fires were not that hot. So, and this is on the surface. The fires are not on the surface. The fires were extinguished, and yet there's still heat. Massive heat. Much more heat than 1,340 degrees down in the base of this pile. That is cooling off by the time it gets to the surface of this pile. Cooling off to 1,340 degrees, something much hotter down there. I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center, says Abolhassan Astani Asl, a structural engineer, professor at Berkeley, who had unlimited access via the National Science Foundation grant to study the steel. So wait a minute. Why is he saying I saw melting of girders? Girders don't melt until 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
Hold on a second. I've got to fix my my little problem here. We're going to go out and then bring back in the show from right here. So he saw melting of girders. Well, he documents the melting of girders, as you see here. From World Trade Center 7, this piece of steel melted. This does not happen in office fires again. Most office fires don't get to be a quarter of the temperatures required to melt steel. And yet the FEMA report, Jonathan Barnett, the author, says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, it takes 4,000 degrees temperature to evaporate steel. So that's a huge problem. But it's also documented by FEMA in their May of 2002 Building Performance Assessment Report. In Appendix C, they have a metallurgical examination, which finds what? Never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, solid steel girder melted into Swiss cheese, like you see here in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. They have no idea what it could be. It's perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, according to the New York Times. Yet it's completely eliminated from the NIST report when they took over the investigation, got rid of all of this evidence, as well as the explosions, which we heard evidence of. Couldn't test. No steel was recovered. No steel. And again, they claim we couldn't test for the steel because it wasn't recovered. Well, wait a minute. We just saw that Building 7 steel was recovered and analyzed in FEMA Appendix C before NIST took over. And here NIST is, John Gross from NIST, handpicking the very piece of steel that was used for that investigation. He denies it, but his shadow is all over the evidence. Official supporters of the story say that the temperatures are maybe 1,200 degrees, but hydrocarbons, which includes building desks and chairs and so forth, and jet fuel, by the way, which we'll get to next week when we get to the Twin Towers, only burn about 600 to 1,400 degrees. Steel had definitely melted. You could see it here pouring out of the material held in the crab claw excavator. We can tell the temperature of molten materials by their color. Steel and iron, 2,500 degrees, exceeding that because it's even white hot pouring out of there. Where are these coming from? What caused the steel to melt? Could thermite have been a possibility? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, well, that would explain the incredible heat, 4,000 degree temperatures thermite puts out. It would explain the elemental iron, molten iron in this case because of all that heat, but elemental iron, not steel, but elemental iron. We haven't used iron in our steel skyscrapers for in our skyscrapers for 100 years. Would also explain the presence of sulfur. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. Okay, so we are getting somewhere here. Let's look at the NFPA 921 guide. It says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later, when pressed, they finally admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you will not test for. But others did. Stephen Jones is one of them, a nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, who analyzes the slag from the ends of a beam from the World Trade Center on the taken to and used in a sculpture at the International Peace Park in Manitoba. He first notes that, gosh, this is a highly irregular cut here. The thermal lances and oxyacetylene torches that they use cut very cleanly at the site. But this is not that, with all the slag coming off also. So he does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis, and he finds what? Iron, manganese, sulfur, aluminum, key ingredients of the residue of ignited thermite. What's that doing on the end of the beam in the World Trade Center? What did the U.S. Geological Survey find in their studies of all the dust, which they include and document very carefully in 2005 in the Particle Atlas of the World Trade Center dust? They find billions of these previously molten iron microspheres. Iron, not steel, iron. They get real curious because they comprise up to 6% of the World Trade Center dust samples. It amounts to about 4 tons of iron microspheres when you extrapolate it and find out how much of the stuff there actually was by how much they found in the actual dust samples. It's 150 times the iron that you find in common office building dust, like this here. That's common office building dust. It's not even spherical. This is what we're talking about here. Evidence and frequency of heat-affected particulates, including spherical particles. They're saying that it takes 2,800 degrees, the melting point of iron, to create these spheres. Well, how did that get so hot? They don't know, but they're formed during the event, according to the R.J. Lee Group, environmental consulting firm, who also analyzed the dust. Not before by the iron workers building the structure, not after by the iron workers tearing it down, but during. There's so many of these, they're used to, and they're so ubiquitous, they're used by the EPA to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. That's what makes it different, but they don't know where they came from. Well, let's look at a thermite experiment and find out how, in this controlled experiment, these spherics might be produced. Looks like thousands of sparks, but they cool and they fall and they turn into almost naked to the human eye, many of them. Some of them are 1/16 of an inch large. Molten iron, previously molten iron microspheres. Well, how do they get spherical? Well, that's what aerosolized liquid does. It forms itself due to surface tension into a sphere. They cool and they fall. Could that be explaining what happens to the toasting of the tops of these cars in and around the World Trade Center? What other rational example in the official story or outside of it is there in this high heat event? What other rational reason? What could produce this? Well, you can make thermite cutter charges in your own backyard and cut through steel, like John Cole, civil engineer, did in his backyard in Florida. Notice that you can hear it, but it's nowhere near the sound level of a typical explosion. And it cuts, in this case, almost cleanly through the beam. Well, there are devices that use thermite that are patented prior to 9/11 that issue molten iron streams in just milliseconds, much more effective at cutting through thicker and thicker sections of steel. So normally they use high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, but those provide very loud bangs, very bright flashes, signatures which the audio and visual you would not want apparent. Is that why they went to thermite? In fact, there are thermite cutter charges or devices, in this case, an igniter, but the casing itself is made out of consolidated thermite, which is consumable. Nothing left behind but pools of molten iron, which are seen all over the place. But what else was seen and analyzed by a team of 8 international scientists in this blanket of dust, 3 inches thick, all around lower Manhattan? They analyzed 7 independently collected samples, like the one from Jeanette McKinley's apartment here. She was an artist. Her windows blew in right across the street from the South Tower on Liberty Street and filled her apartment full of dust, completely traumatizing everybody there, of course. And she paid for this decision brutally because she got brain cancer from having worked with this dust as an artist trying to create the therapy, using her artwork as therapy. Because it's quite unique material, but it's very, very toxic. So they analyzed this dust and documented 4 of these 7 samples. They look like paint, these chips, red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. Some of them up to a 1/16 of an inch long. They thought they were paint, but they come up to a magnet. They're attracted by a magnet. And they zoom in real carefully into the red layer and do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, actually, and find what? Iron, aluminum, the ingredients of thermite, iron and aluminum in the red-gray chips. So this is not paint. They get real curious and zoom into that red layer 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope and find what? Iron oxide crystals, rhomboidal-shaped crystals, and aluminum platelets that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair at the nanoscale. So these are highly engineered particles. They do some research and find that, gosh, this is a type of super thermite. It's just been discussed before. And when in the peer-reviewed literature, when they raise the temperature to 420 degrees Celsius, about 758 Fahrenheit, something happens to them. They produce a lot of energy. And this is indicative of exothermic reactions. In fact, when they produce that energy, those chips produce microspheres, molten iron microspheres, with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres produced at the World Trade Center from the spheres. So they know where these spheres came from. They came from these chips. It's very clear because, in fact, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips. So there's no question where they came from, as you see here. This is a super thermite, originally produced at Lawrence Livermore Lab and documented as such. Ultrafine aluminum and iron oxide engineered to be more explosive. So they've taken an incendiary, which destroys by means of heat, and they've engineered it to become more explosive. So it's got these super qualities. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So this is a set of repeatable, internally consistent experimental data that can be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. And we're seeking to do just that, and we'll tell you how in just a moment. But this 24-page peer-reviewed paper is documented and peer-reviewed and published in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It's called Unreacted Thermitic Material in the World Trade Center Dust. And it should be bothering you enough to do something about, because what we're showing here is the direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries and explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. Why? Well, experts said, no other modern steel frame high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire. This is unprecedented. We need to study this. Why not? We need to find out. one reason steel frame buildings don't collapse before 9/11 anyway, or after, is that fire protected steel frame buildings, they conduct the heat away. If even if they're not fireproofed, when they're not fireproofed, they conduct the heat away. When they are fireproofed, which is all of our steel frame buildings, they provide 2-hour fire protection on the beams and 3 hours on the columns. That keeps fire from ever becoming a problem. We also keep the contractors from building out of combustible materials, the tenants from bringing in fuel loads that are large, and then just to keep all that from becoming a problem, we put sprinklers in these buildings to keep them, to keep those fires from ever growing. In the case of Building 7, the fire sprinkler was put in test mode prior to 9/11 by somebody. And they also claim that the fire water supply for the sprinklers in the building was damaged when the Twin Towers fell. So there were investigations into this building. In 2002, we mentioned FEMA. They had $600,000 worth of funding, which is virtually nothing. Their efforts were hampered. Couldn't get access to the site, the blueprints, the steel, etc., the public. And this is documented by the New York Times. 2008, NIST took over that investigation, beginning with the stated conclusion that fires caused the collapse. And they admit that they've had trouble getting a handle on the collapse of this building, of course. And we looked at the FEMA Appendix C. What did they conclude? Further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue of how this building came down. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, what we have is easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. 400 truckloads a day were carted away from the site in case of Building 7, just 2 weeks after 9/11, and put on a barge and sent to China for recycling. 15 cents a pound was all they got for that steel. That's nothing, according to Abelhaz and Astani Azel. This is the destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Highly illegal. Causing Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to decry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions, is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. Prompting other experts like Danny Jowenko in Europe to start telling the truth.
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
And Hugo Bachmann, chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics and Engineering. In my opinion, the building was with great probability professionally demolished. And more than 100 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of these towers. In this case, Kamal obeyed. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. What can do that? This prompted the 4-year study, which just came out with their results on what caused this building to collapse. This is the University of Alaska. Professor Leroy Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, doing a detailed finite element analysis study, which NIST said that they were tasked to do, but which failed miserably, and that is proven also here in this study, because they sought to be more objective about it. How did the building come down? No other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. We have to ensure the public safety, that we understood the collapse failure mechanism. So they sought first to examine the response to fires. So they actually model a fire in this building in this high-tech software. They rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse and identify the types of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. Using the same data and input data that was used by NIST, the assumptions, even though they found many of them to be faulty, they used them nevertheless so they can compare apples to apples. They simulated local structural response to fire loading for floors 13 and below, as NIST had done, examined the NIST collapse initiation hypotheses, simulated numerous failure scenarios, and identified what would lead to the collapse. So quite a detailed study, focusing, as we did earlier today, on the area of interest and the theory by NIST that that's where the collapse started. And they found that no, they have a lot of problems. They find that another reason the girder could not have slid off of its seat, because it would have been trapped by this side plate as it was expanded and heated and pushed into this cavity. It couldn't be sliding out. They found that it did have shear studs. They found that the stiffeners were missing by NIST. They found that the 13th floor couldn't have crashed through the 12th floor. And they found that the movement of this whole building was inward, it was outward, pushing out the exterior wall, whereas NIST had assumed that and fixed this exterior wall so that it couldn't be pushed outward, so that all their momentum, their movement would be in toward that girder that they then said slipped off of its seat. So all of these problems were documented by the University of Alaska, and NIST assumptions found to be faulty. They found that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail in their model. And if they could have, when they forced it to fail, the building would tip over, as you see here. So in the apples to apples comparison, we have the building tipping over, just as NIST's animation started to do. But then they stop it after 2 seconds, so we don't actually see it all the way tipping over. They conclude at the University of Alaska that this collapse was a global failure, not a progressive collapse, but a global failure involving the near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building. Completely pulling the wool out from underneath NIST. Completely pulling the rug, got my analogies mixed up, out from underneath the NIST report. Fire did not cause the collapse of this building. The temperatures were not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. Building 7 didn't experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse. So you can compare the models and see which one you feel has a greater similarity to the video in the middle. That's what happens when thousands and thousands of concerned citizens pool their resources and allow us to commission a study like this from a university that has the capability to do this kind of work and not rely on our government agencies to tell us the truth. Speaking of which, there's other foreknowledge of this building's collapse. They said, if we allowed it to burn, building 7, because it was on fire, how soon could we anticipate a collapse? Or could we assume a collapse? And this engineer says, well, he was pretty much right on the money. In its current state, you have about 5 hours. So here's an engineer predicting the collapse, which is completely unprecedented. No high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire. And here he's saying you got about 5 hours. Sure enough, about 5 hours later, after witnesses hear those explosions, the building collapses. So this prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge. They won't release the name of the engineer. This is all to be swept under the rug. But there's other foreknowledge too. This is quite interesting. We have these construction workers, serious construction workers who had been, looked like they were coming back from Building 7. They hear an explosion over their shoulder. They look back at Building 7. Then they look straight into the CNN camera. And they say this.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. Building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys. Sorry.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. How do they know the building is about to blow up? It has a few small scattered fires in it. Kevin McPadden, we heard his testimony of explosions before. Now, he was held back about 6 blocks away from Building 7 with others behind the yellow tape, listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. And this is what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here? Well, the BBC announces the collapse of this building 20 minutes before. I'm not kidding you. Take a look.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attack. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. The building standing right behind her. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. But does this make them psychic or something? Well, better reporting than that is from CNN, who announced the collapse of a 50-story building at 11:07.
In New York, Alan Dodds Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan's taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke, like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sack and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
Indeed, there's no other building that was destroyed on 9/11. There were a few damaged buildings, certainly, from some of the beams that hit them. And no other 50-story building. Had this 47-story building collapsed at that time, we wouldn't even have video of it. It would have been obscured by the massive dust cloud released when the towers went down. Maybe it was supposed to come down at that time, but somehow it was a dud. And they had to go back in and fix it. And that's what those mysterious construction workers were doing, perhaps. Interesting. Should be investigated. How about investigating Larry Silverstein, the owner of Building 7? He had it built in the mid-'80s. Became part of the World Trade Center complex. Here's what he says about Building 7, having been interviewed a year later.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Let's repeat this. I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. Well, there's no problem containing the fire. The fire was few. These fires were scattered and small. But they decided, nevertheless, not to fight the fire. And Larry Silverstein says maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. Well, that's a term used in the controlled demolition industry for destroying a building. Well, he would have had to already set those explosives in there, huh? And they made the decision to pull. Well, wait a minute. Firefighters don't pull buildings. He says, oh, I didn't mean the firefighters. I mean the building. I meant the firefighters. Well, the firefighters were not in the building fighting it, so there's nothing to pull. And you don't say pull it if you're talking about firefighters. No manual firefighting operations were taken by FDNY. There's no firefighting in World Trade Center 7. They say again and again. Well, you can make up your own mind. That's arguable speculation, perhaps, but the evidence we showed today, does it support the fire destruction theory or the controlled demolition destruction theory? You have to make up your own mind. We all do. We've shown what we believe is direct evidence of destruction by explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and evidence. We believe that this is proof of controlled demolition. We want to hear from you. What do you believe? And what are your questions? Andy, how do people ask these questions?
Okay, please submit the questions that you have in the input form Richard talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education. You'll find the box to type them in, and we're going to do our best to answer them. And in the meantime, we're going to type about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Indeed. And while you're there, please subscribe to our monthly email newsletter. We send it out, it's more than monthly now. We've got so much going on. We want you to know about it. Latest evidence we're putting together, latest efforts toward a real investigation. It takes 2 minutes. Just put your name and your email in there and get informed about the evidence on our website. We have an incredible section of evidence, videos, papers, technical articles, all kinds of stuff. Sign the petition too. Especially if you're an architect or engineer. We have more than 3,000, but there's 20,000 others supporting them. So please join them on the website and add your name to the effort. Stand up publicly demanding a new investigation and donate to our cause. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have 6 employees. We're all over the place doing work all the time, and only because of you. As you can imagine, we don't get corporate or government grants to do this kind of work. So here's where you can help us out quite a bit. Become a member. Join the family of sustaining supporters at AE 911 Truth. And, for a cup of coffee a month, that's the kind of support that is our bread and butter that keeps us going. If you're not counted among those of us who give at that small level, the thousands of us, you may not be doing your part. And if you can't do that, there's ways you can still help us. Volunteer. Andy, how are some of the ways people can help?
Absolutely. The first way that you can help is by filling out that volunteer form. You do that by going to ae911truth.org. There's a form on there. It's very short. I'll contact you within a day or so. Have a talk, and we'll find out how you best fit in. There's a number of things you can do, whether if you're a quiet person and you like to sit at your computer. There's definite research and looking up people to do outreach to. You can call people on the phone. Government outreach is we're really going to be kicking up to this week, or rather the following week. And then, of course, translating, if you've got that in your skill set, if you got some other language. I'm sure there's some language out there, Richard, we haven't translated our materials into yet that we have a need for. Swahili, there you go. And just so many ways. And there's probably ways, too, that you can think of, ideas that I haven't even thought of. So please, if you've got time to do that, fill out that volunteer form and be part of this team. And I think now, in this time in world history, people are more open to questioning official narratives.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you guys for helping us out. Really important stuff here. If you like to work alone, contact your elected representatives, your television, radio, newspaper folks. Send them the ae911truth.org link. Tell everybody send every architect and engineer you can find our website so that they can see it. Some of the videos we've done, I'll show you. Screen the DVDs, share the brochures, $10 for 100 of them, hand them out to people that you want to know the truth about 9/11, because it changed everything. Not too dissimilar from COVID-19, which is changing a lot of things. But 9/11 started a whole set of events. We've lost our civil liberties, which we took for granted, and some of us don't even know that they've been demolished substantially after 9/11. We're in a $6.5 trillion global war on terror still because of 9/11. So let's speak up about this issue, and know that we've taken that study of the University of Alaska, and you can download that 135-page report, by the way, for free at WTC7evaluation.org. We've used it in a request for correction, which we have put it to NIST, 8 separate points, and more of the evidence that you've heard today has gone to them as well. They've written back and said, gosh, we think we did a good job. We stand by our original answers. And they didn't even answer the specific points of problems that we've addressed. So we're appealing that decision now, and we'll take it all the way. And we're taking it also to our congressional members. How are we doing that, Andy?
Absolutely. So this is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who died at the age of 26 as he was entering the North Tower lobby. He was killed by an explosion, and that doesn't really jive with the official narrative. So right there, by the very nature of how he died, we have an immediate conversation starter with your representatives. And how this came up was that we had this petition for years, demanding a new investigation from Congress into the destruction of these towers. And then we said, hey, let's do most of the work for them. So we wrote this draft legislation, and we just need one congressman to introduce it. It's a great time, too, because they just had an election. There's new people coming in various places. And every time you get new representatives, then you can always have a new opportunity to reach somebody. And you never know who you're dealing with until you actually deal them. You can't trust corporate media and what they say about somebody. You got to actually deal with them yourself. We've learned that. So how do you get involved, and how do you get this put through? First way is to go to ae911truth.org/justice, and it'll tell you all about the bill. It's got a form on there where you can fill in your address. It'll automatically send a email to your representatives, depending on where you live. You can print it out, hand it to your congressman's office when they return from DC, especially, or take it to the local office and drop it off. I mean, nobody in DC does anything they'd rather not do unless they have a lot of political pressure. You generate political pressure first by participating yourself, and then when you show that leadership, other people get inspired and follow you. So are you that leader? Are you going to get justice for Bobby McIlvaine and the nearly 3,000 others that died? That's what you have to ask yourself and get involved.
Thank you, Andy. I hope people will do just that, and because we've got so many opportunities here. This one is the U.S. attorney who's agreed in writing to comply with the law, which requires him to give our evidence, because we submitted 60 exhibits of it in a petition, to a special grand jury. So he's got to do that. And we've sued him to prove that he is doing that. And we've also sued the FBI because they didn't give our evidence to Congress as required in the 2015 9/11 Commission review, which required them to give all the evidence that they've accumulated since the 9/11 Commission report was issued. So this has prompted 5 New York City area fire commissioners to unanimously call for a resolution for a new investigation. And he says, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we'll be an unstoppable force. So he continues his work on that front, as we do, starting in 2013 when we created this documentary, our landmark documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. We've assembled the high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence themselves. I'll give you just a sneak peek.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in freefall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can watch this DVD for free on YouTube, the 1-hour version. The 90-minute version, which also includes 40 extra interviews with all of these experts, is on our store, in our store at ae911truth.org. So I encourage you to do that. Also, the 50-page booklet you can download, read for free, the PDF. Or you can get the, and that's at beyondmisinformation.org. Or you can get the coffee table, great quality book and give to somebody important like yourself, and have it available. It's an extraordinary piece that rips it lays out all this evidence and rips NIST, exposing their lies. The classic lecture, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, is available free on YouTube, as is the 15-minute documentary on Building 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner. Encourage you to watch that. You can also get the DVDs in our store. But questions, I think we got some today, don't we, Andy? I'm sure we do.
All right. Yes, we do. All right. So we have one question that came in today. We also had an article from the New York Times. So we are going to check that out. We got to read it first, though. But the question asks, in a NIST video called Why the Buildings Fell, NIST says it was only the shell of the building that is falling. But in the frequently asked questions to NIST about Building 7, question 11 asks NIST about the free fall scene in the collapse. And the response to NIST only talks about the north face that we see falling, it's as if they no longer want to say it's the entire four-walled shell that is falling. Why does NIST change their answer to only mentioning the north side of the building when it comes to the question of free fall?
I think, well, first of all, let's all acknowledge that NIST is between a rock and a hard place here. They're trying to explain something that's impossible. They're trying to explain that the building came down by fire, which is unprecedented. Even though it came down at Freefall, which they were forced to acknowledge, having been publicly embarrassed by members of AE 9/11 Truth, like David Chandler and Stephen Jones. So they had to finally deal with it. And their answer was that, well, they were watching a pixel on the video at the top of the building, and it moved. And so they started their movement downward from that point in time, which gave them 5 or so extra seconds to manipulate and try to convince people that this building didn't come down at freefall. They were caught and exposed in that lie. So now they're trying to say, well, we watched the north face come down. I think they were just watching the north face. I don't think they were saying the north face of the building alone came down at freefall. There are several different views of this building's collapse. They all came down. So I don't think NIST is actually trying to claim the north face came down at freefall and the others came down in some other fashion. The whole building came down at freefall. That's real obvious. So I don't think that's what they're saying. Andy, you have a thought on that one?
Well, I kind of dragged up the NIST FAQ where they talk about this. They say the instant at which vertical motion of the roof line first occurred was determined by tracking the numerical value of the brightness of a pixel, a single element in the video at the roof line. The pixel became brighter as the roof line began to descend because the color of the pixel started to change. So I hope that was not based on something else. So basically, the term they started, I forgot the time, but I think you said 5 seconds, Richard.
Yeah.
Or not, and they based it on the change of color of a pixel while the building stands there. So take that for what you will. But as Richard said earlier, yeah, they're between a rock and a hard place because they're trying to prove something that's impossible. And that seems to be the trend in governments these days.
Yeah. So position yourselves accordingly. We've shown evidence for controlled demolition in part 1. Hey, guess what? Next week, we're going to jump to the Twin Towers. We're going to show you the specific sets of evidence there in the Twin Towers explosive destruction. We're going to be looking at the explosions by seen and heard by witnesses, lots of them. Sudden near free fall collapse. Again, we're talking about an unusually fast collapse. It doesn't decelerate, it accelerates. And it shouldn't have if this building structure was underneath it. High velocity lateral ejections, 600 feet in every direction, 80 miles an hour laterally. How does that happen? A force is required to accomplish that. And shattering of the steel frame from top to bottom. Almost the entire, all the elements that were bolted together are shattered one from another, save these shards down at the bottom of the building. And then the midair pulverization of the concrete, 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to a dust in these explosions. So we're going to be looking at all that in quite some detail. We hope you'll join us. The week after that, we jump to the extreme heat in the Twin Towers. Much more detail than we've gotten into today on the extreme heat there. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and Andy particularly. We appreciate you being here to help us out of a jam. Looks like we didn't have too many technical difficulties today. That's good. And we'll catch all of you in a week, 1 o'clock Thursday. Okay, come back. Bye for now.